I needed a couch and fast. Craigslist offered the most budget-friendly options. After a few days of browsing, I found a post. Lightly used couch, moving sale, $50. Contact Mike. It seemed perfect when I arrived at the listed address. An old, sagging house at the edge of the city. The sun was already sinking below the horizon, casting long shadows that made everything feel twice as eerie. Mike opened the door, a thin man, his eyes sunken and his smile too wide, as though stretched on by force. "Come in," he urged, stepping aside. The house smelled of stale air, like it hadn't been aired out in years. The walls were bare, the furniture mismatched and sparse. It was the kind of place that whispered neglect. The couch was exactly as pictured, sitting in the middle of the room, almost too perfect. I ran my hand over the fabric. It felt clean, even comfortable. $50, right? I asked, already pulling out my wallet. Mike nodded, taking the cash without a word. "Let's get it to your car," he said quickly. As we carried the couch through the narrow hallway, something caught my eye, a wall covered in photographs and clippings. All the pictures showed homes, normal houses, just like the one I was moving into. Beneath each photo was a date, scrawled in black ink. The newest date was today. My heart stuttered. "You're interested in crime stories?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though my pulse thundered in my ears. He glanced at the wall and smiled. "Just a hobby," he muttered. By the time we shoved the couch into the back of my car, the air between us had thickened. I muttered a quick thanks, eager to leave, but Mike's eyes lingered on me a second too long. That gaze, it felt like he was memorizing my face, tucking it away for later. That night, I tried to shake off the strange encounter, but the sense of being watched lingered, an itch beneath my skin that I couldn't scratch. It wasn't until the following week that things got worse. I was sitting on the couch, unwinding after work, when I heard it, a soft scrape at the window, a sound too deliberate to be the wind. My heart jolted, and I turned the TV off to listen. Silence. Then came the unmistakable sound of a door handle being tested, the slow, measured rattle of someone seeing if they could slip in quietly. My blood ran cold as I remembered I had left the patio door unlocked earlier in the day. I crept to the kitchen, gripping my phone tightly, hands shaking as I dialed 911. Before I could press call, I froze. A shadow passed just beyond the kitchen window, tall and thin, moving deliberately toward the patio. The door clicked open. I dropped behind the counter, heart hammering so loudly I thought whoever was inside would hear it. The soft pad of footsteps moved through the house, unhurried and calm, as if the intruder knew the layout by heart. Each step brought them closer to the kitchen, closer to me. I clenched my teeth, squeezing the phone so hard it felt like it would snap. I could see the edge of his shadow just beyond the counter. He was right there, so close I could hear his breathing. And then silence. I stayed frozen in place, every muscle screaming to bolt. After what felt like hours, I peeked around the counter. The back door was wide open, swaying slightly in the wind. The police arrived 30 minutes later, but by then, the house was empty. They told me it could have been a random break-in, just bad luck. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. That man from Craigslist, he knew where I lived. He'd been watching me. I didn't keep the couch. The next day, I left it by the curb and changed every lock on the house. Even now, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, certain I heard footsteps or the scrape of a door handle. I check the windows and doors 4 times a night, always locking, always double-checking. Because once someone knows where you sleep, you're never really alone again. I was home alone, a rare thing since my roommate was always around, but she was away visiting family for the weekend. It felt like a chance to unwind, a night of mindless TV, snacks, and uninterrupted quiet. The house felt too still, though, one of those heavy silences where you can hear the tick of the wall clock from another room. I locked the front door and slid the chain into place, feeling a little better. But an hour later, the knocking came, soft, almost polite. At first, I thought it was the rain, but it persisted with an unnerving rhythm. I peeked through the peephole. It was the neighbor, She stood on the porch, drenched, her soaked coat clinging to her. I'd only seen her a few times. She'd moved in a month ago, always polite but reserved. I wasn't sure why she'd come, especially this late. Something about the way she stood there still, with her head tilted slightly, set me on edge. Her eyes searched the street, and then she looked right at my door, almost like she could see through the peephole. A strange unease settled in my gut. Why was she standing out there in the middle of a storm? I hesitated, thinking she might need help, but something stopped me from opening the door. I watched as she lingered on the porch for another moment before slowly turning and walking away. The way she moved unsettled me. Too calm, too deliberate for someone caught in a downpour. She disappeared into the rain, and I locked the door tighter, telling myself I was being paranoid. But the night didn't return to peace. Not long after, I heard footsteps. They were faint just above me. My heart leapt into my throat. There shouldn't have been anyone upstairs. I stared at the ceiling, waiting, frozen on the couch. The footsteps grew louder, more deliberate, as if whoever it was had all the time in the world. I grabbed my phone from the coffee table, my hands trembling. There was no way to mistake those sounds. Someone was inside the house, walking from room to room. I tried to convince myself it was the wind or the pipes, but I knew better. Then the sound stopped right above me. The silence stretched too long, my breath loud in my own ears. I stared at the ceiling, waiting, hoping it was nothing. A slow creak followed, a deliberate shift in weight. Whoever was up there was moving again, this time towards the stairs. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't even move. The soft tread on the steps made my stomach churn. They were coming down. I got off the couch as quietly as I could, every nerve on fire, every step measured, praying I wouldn't make a sound. I moved toward the kitchen where my phone charger was. If I could just grab my phone, call someone, but the footsteps stopped again halfway down the stairs. I reached the kitchen, hand on the counter, breath caught in my throat. I dared to peek around the corner, and there she was, the neighbor. She was halfway down the stairs, staring, her head slightly tilted, a smile just barely visible in the dim light. I ducked back behind the counter, heart pounding. I knew then that she'd been inside the whole time. Somehow, she'd slipped in when I wasn't paying attention. The realization was like a punch to the gut. I grabbed my phone and fumbled to unlock it, my hand shaking so badly I almost dropped it. But just as I dialed 911, I heard her footsteps again, faster this time, almost playful. She was coming down the stairs, her boots clicking against the wood. I whispered my address to the operator and crouched behind the counter, clutching the phone like a lifeline. Her footsteps paused, just beyond the kitchen door. I held my breath, willing myself to be invisible. Then, the sound I dreaded most, the soft click of the kitchen door as it swung open. She stepped inside, and I could see her shadow stretching across the floor, her head still tilted, that faint smile edged across her lips. She stood there, listening, waiting, as if savoring the moment. My pulse thundered in my ears. I couldn't stay hidden much longer. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. And then, the faintest shuffle, the sound of her taking another step closer. Just as I thought I couldn't bear it, there was a knock at the front door, a heavy, urgent pounding. She froze, her shadow jerking slightly. I held my breath, praying it was the police, praying they would get here in time. The knock came again, louder this time. She let out a quiet sigh, like a child caught doing something they knew they shouldn't. I watched as her shadow shifted, moving away from the door. And just like that, she was gone. The front door creaked open, and I heard voices, officers calling my name. I scrambled out from behind the counter, gasping for air as I stumbled to the door. The police were there, and for the first time that night, I felt like I could breathe again. But when I looked out into the storm, she was already gone, vanished into the rain, as though she had never been there. They searched the house and the surrounding area, but found no sign of her. No sign that she had ever been inside. But I knew better. She had been inside. She had been waiting. And even now, long after that night, I still check the locks on every door, every window, because somewhere out there, She's waiting again. Just me and some quiet time to recharge while my partner was out of town. I wasn't expecting any visitors, and the first day had gone smoothly, with nothing more than the sounds of a peaceful neighborhood to accompany me. The knock at the door came just after nightfall. I almost ignored it, but something about the steady rhythm drew me toward it. I looked through the peephole, but saw no one. Shrugging it off as kids playing a prank, I turned back toward the living room. Then I heard it again, that same deliberate knock. Like whoever was out there knew exactly how to draw my attention without alarming me too much. When I opened the door, there was a man standing on the porch. He looked ordinary, just shy of middle-aged, dressed casually, with a worn leather bag slung over one shoulder. He said he was a friend of a neighbor from down the street, someone I'd met only once. I should have sent him away, but his manner was calm, polite, almost familiar. He said he was locked out of his house and just needed to make a quick call. Something about his tone made me feel cornered, like it would be rude to refuse. So I let him in. He didn't make his call right away. Instead, he asked if I had some water. Then he wanted to sit down just for a moment. Each request was small, harmless on its own, but they piled up until suddenly this man was in my living room, seated on my couch, sipping water like we were old friends. I told myself I was overreacting. He would leave soon, I thought. But as the minutes stretched on, the air grew heavier, every second laced with a growing discomfort I couldn't quite place. His gaze lingered on things too long. On my bookshelves, the framed photos on the walls, even a jacket draped over the back of a chair. He commented on the house, complimenting it in a way that felt too familiar, as though he knew the layout better than he should have. My skin prickled. That creeping sense of something being off settled deep into my bones, but I still didn't say anything. I couldn't. Politeness had me paralyzed. Then he asked to use the bathroom, relieved to have him out of my sight. I pointed him down the hall. The moment he disappeared behind the bathroom door, the unease that had been simmering finally boiled over. I stood in the middle of the room, heart pounding, listening to the soft shuffle of his steps. He was taking too long. Something was wrong. Everything about this was wrong. The water glass sat untouched on the table, a small, grim reminder that he hadn't really needed anything at all. I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't coming back through that door. Quietly, I tiptoed to the hall and pressed my ear to the bathroom door. Nothing. No movement. No sound of water running. My heart raced faster, and with a shaky hand, I reached for the knob. The door swung open, empty. The bathroom window was shut, the curtain drawn neatly aside. He was gone. I spun around, skin crawling, and nearly stumbled as I heard it, the faintest creak of a floorboard from the other end of the hall. He wasn't in the bathroom. He was already somewhere deeper inside the house. My throat tightened. I wanted to run, but my feet felt heavy, as if every step would betray me with a sound. I grabbed my phone from the kitchen counter, but before I could dial, I heard him upstairs, walking room to room. The sickening realization hit me. He was searching for something, and he wasn't planning to leave. I slipped into the pantry, my hands trembling so badly I could barely hold the phone. I dialed 911 and whispered my address, barely able to keep my voice steady. The operator's voice felt distant, almost unreal against the thud of footsteps above me. He was moving quickly now, his steps urgent, as if time was running out. The sound of the closet doors opening upstairs made my heart stutter. He was checking every space, every room, and soon he would come downstairs. I pressed my back to the shelves, praying he wouldn't think to look in the pantry. The door to the bedroom slammed open above, and for a brief moment, the whole house fell deathly silent. Then I heard it, the slow creak of the stairs. He was coming down, step by deliberate step, his shoes tapping lightly on the wooden planks. The silence between each step stretched thin, tightening around me like a noose. I held my breath, squeezing my phone until my knuckles ached. He reached the bottom of the stairs. I could hear him just beyond the pantry door, his breathing steady and calm, as if he knew exactly where I was. The knob twitched, rattling once, twice, and then Just when I thought he would open the door, the distant wail of police sirens broke through the suffocating quiet. The footsteps stopped, the front door creaked open, and then silence. It felt like hours before I dared move, every muscle burning from staying frozen in place. I stumbled out of the pantry just as the police arrived, breathless and shaking. They searched the house, but the man was already gone, vanished, leaving no trace behind. I changed the locks that night, added bolts to every door and window. But even now, every time I hear the faintest creak or tap in the night, I know he's still out there, somewhere, waiting for another door to open. It had been a long night, the kind that drains every ounce of energy from you. I was heading home from a work event, exhausted, and the drive through the empty streets felt endless, with only the hum of my car engine for company. I approached a red light at an empty intersection. I noticed a car pull up directly behind me, a black sedan, its headlights glaring in my rearview mirror. There was nothing remarkable about the car, but something about the way it stopped too close to my bumper made my stomach twist. The road ahead was empty, plenty of room to maneuver. Yet it idled there, unmoving, its headlights pinned on me. I told myself it was nothing, just a coincidence. The light turned green, and I continued driving, hoping the car would turn off at the next intersection. But it didn't. It followed, staying just a little too close. Not tailgating, but close enough to make my skin crawl. I switched lanes. So did the sedan. I took the next left, testing it. The car followed. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as a cold sweat crept down my back. The city streets felt like a maze closing in around me. I glanced in the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of the driver's silhouette, a dark shape, unmoving, staring straight ahead. There was no reason to follow me. I hadn't done anything unusual. I wasn't speeding. I wasn't blocking traffic. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, just some random commuter taking the same route home. But deep down, I knew. The car wasn't just following. It was waiting for me to react. I turned onto a side street, a quieter road leading away from my usual route. My pulse quickened as I saw the sedan make the same turn, gliding through the night like a predator in pursuit. The narrow street felt suffocating, the darkness thicker between the broken streetlights. My mouth went dry, each passing second pressed heavier against my chest. I was being followed, and the worst part was not knowing why. I needed to lose them. I sped up slightly, heart hammering in my chest as I made a sharp right into an alley that cut through the neighborhood. For a moment, I thought I had shaken them. The street fell silent, my headlights casting flickering beams along the graffiti-covered walls. But just as I breathed a shallow sigh of relief, the black sedan turned into the alley behind me. Panic clawed at my throat. I hit the gas, the tires squealing against the wet asphalt, my car fishtailing slightly as I raced through the narrow space. The alley was tight, barely wide enough for two cars, and every second I expected to hear the crash of metal on metal as the sedan rammed into me. But it didn't. It kept pace, following just close enough to remind me it was still there, waiting. At the end of the alley, I swerved back onto the main road, my hands slick with sweat as I gripped the wheel. The sedan followed, relentless. I made another sharp turn, then another, winding through unfamiliar streets, trying to outmaneuver the car. My heart pounded in my ears, my breaths coming fast and shallow. I was burning through fuel, and I knew I couldn't keep this up much longer. I needed a plan, but my mind was blank, paralyzed by fear. Then I saw it, a gas station up ahead, its neon sign flickering weakly in the night. It was my only chance. I veered sharply into the lot, skidding to a stop in front of the convenience store. The tires squealed, and the car lurched forward as I slammed on the brakes. I threw the car in a park and looked around frantically. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. And then the black sedan pulled into the lot, stopping at the far edge, just out of reach of the dim lights. The engine idled quietly, headlights off, but the silhouette inside was still there, watching, waiting. I bolted out of my car, sprinting toward the store. My pulse raced with the fear that I wouldn't make it. I felt exposed under the flickering lights, as if the driver could pounce at any second. The sliding glass doors hissed open, and I stumbled inside, gasping for breath. The cashier glanced at me, disinterested, and I tried to calm my racing heart. I stayed by the door, peeking out at the lot. The sedan remained where it was, the engine humming softly. The driver didn't move. Minutes passed. My mind spun with possibilities, each worse than the last. Who was this person? Why were they following me? Then, without warning, the engine roared to life. The car backed up slowly, turned toward the exit, and disappeared into the night, leaving nothing behind but the distant hum of traffic. I stayed in the gas station for nearly an hour, pacing the aisles, my nerves shot. Every time I thought about leaving, my chest tightened with the fear that the car would be waiting just out of sight. When I finally worked up the courage to drive home, the streets felt emptier than before. Every passing shadow made my stomach churn. Every flickering streetlight felt like a warning. By the time I reached my house, I was too exhausted to think straight. I parked in the driveway, locked the doors, and sat in the car for a long time, listening to the ticking of the cooling engine. I stared into the darkness, waiting, just waiting, convinced that the sedan would reappear at any moment. It never did, but even now, every time I drive through the city at night, I catch myself checking the mirrors, searching for those same headlights. Because somewhere out there, that driver is still watching, still waiting. I booked a remote Airbnb to get away for a few days, somewhere quiet to clear my head. The place was a small cabin tucked away in the woods, far enough from town that cell service was spotty, but the photos promised a serene escape. When I arrived, everything seemed perfect. I settled in quickly, unpacking my bags and telling myself I deserved this break. First night passed uneventfully, but the second night felt different. As the sun set, the woods outside the windows turned into a black sea, thick and impenetrable, as if they were hiding something just beyond sight. I tried to ignore the creeping feeling that settled in as I locked the door and closed the curtains. It was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. Around midnight, I heard a noise outside, just a faint crunch like footsteps on gravel. My heart skipped. I sat up in bed, straining to hear more through the thin walls of the cabin. At first, I thought it might be an animal, but the sound was too deliberate, too steady. Someone was walking around the cabin. I held my breath as the soft crunches circled the building, moving methodically from one side to the next. Every instinct told me not to move. I lay perfectly still in the darkness, listening to each step. Whoever was out there wasn't in a hurry. They were taking their time. The footsteps stopped near the front door. The cabin had one of those old-fashioned wooden doors with a latch instead of a lock. I cursed myself for not bringing a better lock with me, but I had thought this place would be safe. The latch rattled softly, as if someone was testing it. My stomach nodded. If I made a noise now, whoever was out there would know I was awake. I stayed frozen, my heart hammering so loudly I was sure they could hear it through the door. The latch clicked again, harder this time, but still didn't open. The silence that followed was worse than the noise, like whoever was outside was deciding what to do next. Then the steps moved again, this time toward the side window. I gritted my teeth, staring at the drawn curtains, praying they wouldn't open. The fear was suffocating, a thick pressure that made it hard to breathe. I could see the faintest shadow through the curtain as someone stood just outside the glass. They weren't moving, just standing there listening, waiting. Minutes crawled by, each second dragging longer than the last. I could feel the weight of their presence pressing in on me, filling the small space of the cabin. Then, slowly, the shadow shifted. The footsteps crunched again, moving around the cabin toward the back door. I had to make a decision. If I stayed here and they got in, I'd be trapped. The cabin was too small, and there was nowhere to run. But if I tried to leave, I'd have to face whoever or whatever was outside. I slid silently out of bed, every movement painfully slow. The floor creaked beneath my weight, and I winced, holding my breath. I inched toward my phone on the nightstand, but the screen was dark, No signal. I fought the rising panic, telling myself to stay calm. I reached the kitchen and grabbed the largest knife I could find, my hand shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. The cabin felt like it was collapsing in on itself. The walls too close, the air too thin. I could still hear the footsteps, now at the back of the cabin. Then they stopped. The sudden silence was unbearable. I gripped the knife tighter, staring at the back door, waiting for it to swing open. But nothing happened. The stillness stretched until it felt like it would snap. And then, without warning, the front door latch clicked again. This time, it gave way with a soft pop. The door creaked open an inch, then two. Cold night air spilled into the cabin, carrying the smell of damp earth and pine. I felt every muscle in my body lock up as the door swung wider, revealing nothing but darkness beyond the threshold. I knew then that they were waiting for me to come out. I stood there, paralyzed by indecision, until I heard it, the faintest shift of weight, a soft shuffle just beyond the open door. They were there just out of sight, waiting. The darkness seemed to pulse with their presence, heavy and patient. I forced myself to back away, every step feeling like a lifetime. I slipped into the bathroom and locked the door behind me, collapsing onto the cold tile floor. The knife trembled in my hands as I sat with my back pressed to the wall, staring at the crack under the door. For what felt like hours, I stayed like that, listening for any sound from the other side of the cabin. But the silence stretched on, suffocating and absolute. No footsteps, no voices, just the endless weight of knowing someone was out there. When the first light of dawn crept under the bathroom door, I finally dared to move. I opened the door slowly, every muscle in my body tight with fear. The cabin was empty. The front door stood ajar, swinging gently in the morning breeze. There was no sign of anyone. I left the cabin that morning, driving away as fast as I could, my heart still racing. I never looked back. But even now, whenever I rent a place to stay, I double-check every lock, every window. Because somewhere out there, someone knows I'll be alone again, and next time, they might not wait outside. I work late shifts driving for a rideshare company, picking up strangers in the dead of night to make some extra cash. Most nights are uneventful, just quiet rides through empty streets, but that night was different from the start. Something about the air felt heavy, like it was holding its breath. The request came in just before midnight, a pickup in a quiet neighborhood at the edge of the city. I pulled up to the curb and waited. The porch light of the house flickered once, but no one came out right away. I was about to cancel the ride when the back door of my car opened, and someone slipped inside without a word. There was something unsettling about him from the moment he sat down. His clothes were wrinkled, and he smelled faintly of dirt, like he'd been outside for too long. I glanced at him in the rearview mirror, a man in his late 40s, slouched in the seat with his hands buried deep in his pockets. He stared straight ahead, silent, his face partially hidden in the dim light of the street lamp. I asked him to confirm his destination, but he didn't answer right away. He just sat there, as if he were listening to something only he could hear. Finally, in a low, tired voice, he mumbled the name of a street I didn't recognize. It wasn't on my app, and it wasn't anywhere I knew. I told myself it was just some small back road I hadn't heard of and decided to keep driving. The city lights faded behind us as we headed toward the outskirts of town, the roads becoming darker and narrower. I kept checking the mirror, glancing at him, but he sat so still it was like he was carved from stone. His eyes never left the windshield, and his expression never changed. The GPS recalculated, and the route twisted into unfamiliar territory, a network of winding streets that felt like they didn't belong. My hands tightened on the wheel. I told myself everything was fine, that I had done dozens of late-night rides without a problem, but the silence in the car grew heavier with each passing mile. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones, the way the air thickened between us. My passenger never checked his phone, never made small talk, never asked about the route. He just sat there, unmoving, waiting for something. As we drove deeper into the dark streets, My unease grew into full-blown anxiety. I realized I had no idea where we were going. The app flickered, struggling to keep up with the signal, and I noticed the little blue to me circling aimlessly on the map. The next intersection was deserted, just an old street light buzzing overhead, and my passenger shifted in his seat for the first time. I heard the faint rustle of fabric as he adjusted his posture, leaning slightly forward, as if preparing for something. That was when I saw it, the glint of something metallic in his pocket, half hidden by his coat. My pulse spiked, and my stomach turned cold. I tried to keep my breathing steady, but every instinct told me to get out of the situation fast. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was just past 1 in the morning, and no one knew where I was. The roads we were on didn't even look real, just stretches of pavement swallowed by trees and shadows. I needed to act. I spotted a gas station up ahead, the neon sign flickering weakly in the distance. It was my only chance. I slowed the car, pretending I needed to check the route, and pulled into the parking lot. The station was empty, no cars, no people, but at least it had lights. I put the car in park and turned to the passenger, forcing myself to stay calm. He stared back at me, his eyes hollow and tired, as if he hadn't slept in days. I told him I needed a moment to check the map, then opened the door slowly, trying not to seem too obvious. As soon as my foot touched the ground, I felt his gaze lock onto me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I walked toward the gas station entrance, my heart hammering in my chest, the air thick with the promise of something I didn't want to face. The door chimed as I stepped inside, but there was no one behind the counter. The station was deserted, except for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. I turned to look back at my car and saw him. He hadn't moved from his seat, but he was watching me through the rear window, his face half hidden by the darkness. His hand was still buried in his coat pocket, and I knew whatever was in there wasn't good. I grabbed my phone, my fingers trembling as I tried to call for help, but the screen flickered. No signal. The reality of how isolated I was hit me all at once, and my mind raced with options. I had to act fast before he decided to follow me inside. I ducked behind the counter, hoping to stay out of sight, and peered through the windows. The car door opened slowly. My passenger stepped out, moving with a kind of eerie calm, as if he had all the time in the world. He stood next to the car, scanning the parking lot, his gaze sweeping across the empty street. He wasn't in a hurry. He was waiting for what I didn't know. I crouched lower, heart pounding in my ears. The minutes dragged on, each second a battle against the rising tide of panic. He just stood there, his hand still in his pocket, as if deciding what to do next. And then, without warning, he got back into the car. The door shut with a soft click, and the engine rumbled to life. He pulled out of the lot slowly, disappearing into the night like a shadow slipping between cracks. I stayed hidden behind the counter long after the sound of the engine faded. The silence felt unbearable, thick with the weight of what could have happened. When I finally worked up the courage to leave, I walked back to my car on shaking legs, every step heavy with dread. The ride home was a blur. Every set of headlights in my rearview mirror made my chest tighten. Every turn felt like a potential trap. When I reached my apartment, I parked and sat in the car for a long time, gripping the steering wheel, too afraid to move. Even now, the memory of that night lingers. Every time I pick up a passenger, I wonder if it'll be him again, if he's still out there, waiting for the right moment to finish what he started. I moved into a new apartment a few weeks ago, a small studio on the 3rd floor of an old building in a quiet part of town. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and I had been looking forward to finally living on my own. My apartment had one large window that looked out onto the street below, and at night, I usually kept the curtains slightly open to let in a little light from the street lamp outside. It was sometime after midnight when I noticed the man for the first time. I was lying on my bed, scrolling through my phone, when a movement by the window caught my eye. Just a faint shift in the shadows, like something out of place. I sat up, my heart skipping a beat. There he was standing on the sidewalk across the street, directly beneath the glow of the street lamp. He wasn't moving, just standing there with his head tilted slightly upward, staring right at my window. At me, a cold knot formed in my stomach. At first, I thought it was just a random passerby, but he didn't walk away. He didn't move at all. He just stood there, watching. I told myself it was nothing, that people did strange things sometimes. Maybe he was waiting for someone. But the minutes stretched on, and still, he didn't leave. The longer I stared at him, the more uneasy I felt. I pulled the curtain closed, but it didn't help. The thought of him still standing there, watching, gnawed at me. I tried to distract myself with my phone, but I kept glancing back at the window, imagining him still standing in that same spot beneath the street lamp. After what felt like forever, I decided to take a quick look. I edged toward the curtain, my heart racing, and pulled it back just enough to peek through the crack. He was still there, but now he was closer. He had moved to the other side of the street, standing just beneath my building. His face was still turned upward, eyes locked on my window. He knew I was watching. Panic bubbled up in my chest. I closed the curtain again, tighter this time, and backed away from the window. Every hair on my body stood on end, and my skin prickled with the feeling that something was very wrong. I grabbed my phone and checked the time. It was almost 2 a.m., too late to call anyone without sounding ridiculous. Too early for it to be just someone drunk wandering the streets. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe he would leave soon. Maybe I was overreacting. But the silence in the apartment felt heavier now, as if the walls were pressing in on me. I sat on the edge of my bed, waiting, listening. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen felt deafening in the quiet. Every creak of the old building made my skin crawl. Then I heard it, a faint tap at the window. It was soft, almost polite, like the brush of a fingertip against the glass. But it was deliberate. Someone was outside my window. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I lived on the 3rd floor. There was no fire escape, no ledge wide enough for anyone to stand on. The tap came again, a slow, measured sound that sent a chill down my spine. I wanted to run, to leave the apartment, but my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. Every instinct screamed at me not to move. I sat there, paralyzed, staring at the closed curtain. The seconds dragged on, each one more unbearable than the last. I knew he was still out there, just on the other side of the glass, waiting. I couldn't stay still any longer. I had to know. Slowly, I got up, my legs trembling beneath me, and inched toward the window. I reached out with shaking hands and pulled the curtain back just enough to see through. He was right there, his face pressed against the glass, his eyes wide and unblinking. His breath fogged the glass in slow, even bursts, as if he had all the time in the world. His lips curled into the faintest smile, as though he knew how much fear he had planted inside me. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the edge of the bed. The curtain fluttered shut again, but it didn't matter. I knew he wasn't leaving. I grabbed my phone, hands shaking so badly I could barely unlock the screen. I dialed 911, whispering my address to the operator, but the words felt useless, like they wouldn't reach anyone in time. I huddled on the bed, the phone clutched to my chest, waiting for the sound of sirens. But the apartment remained silent. The only noise, the faint hum of the street lamp outside. Minutes passed, then hours. I stayed awake the entire night, listening, waiting. I never heard him leave, never heard the sound of footsteps fading down the street. When the first light of morning finally crept through the cracks in the curtain, I dared to look again. He was gone. But even now, every night when I close the curtain, I wonder if he's out there again, standing just beyond the glass, waiting for the moment I let my guard down. And every time I hear a tap at the window, I know it's only a matter of time before he comes back. Subscribe. I took the night shift at a 24-hour convenience store on the outskirts of town to make some extra cash. It was quiet most nights, with only a handful of customers, truckers passing through, the occasional insomniac looking for cigarettes or snacks. But that night, something felt off from the moment I unlocked the doors. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting an unnatural glow over the shelves. The silence outside felt heavier than usual, pressing against the windows like a thick fog. Hours passed slowly. I scanned the parking lot between restocking shelves, waiting for something to break the monotony. The hum of the refrigerators and the distant ticking of the wall clock were the only sounds filling the stillness. It was nearing 2 a.m. when the doorbell chimed, startling me. I looked up from behind the counter, expecting another half-asleep traveler, but the man who entered didn't look like someone passing through. He wore a hooded jacket, damp from the drizzle outside, and his movements were deliberate, as if he knew exactly what he was here for. He didn't grab a basket or browse the aisles. He moved slowly along the shelves, his eyes flicking toward the counter every few steps. Something about the way he watched me made my skin crawl, like he was trying to decide if I was worth the trouble. I tried to focus on my work, but the air felt dense, the kind of tension you feel right before a storm hits. I couldn't help but notice the way he lingered in the far corners of the store, out of the reach of the security cameras. Minutes passed, and he hadn't picked up a single item. I stared at the clock, watching the second hand crawl forward, hoping he'd get bored and leave. But he didn't. He just kept pacing, weaving through the aisles as if waiting for the right moment. I glanced toward the phone behind the counter, thinking about calling my manager, but I didn't want to overreact. Maybe he was just looking for something, or maybe he was waiting for me to make a mistake. Then he disappeared behind one of the shelves. For a moment, the store felt too quiet, like the building was holding its breath. I craned my neck, trying to see where he had gone, but the aisles were empty. My stomach twisted. I knew he was still inside, but now I couldn't see him. I stood there, frozen behind the counter, listening for any sound, a footstep, a shuffle, anything. The clock ticked louder in the silence, each second dragging longer than the last. Then I heard it, a soft click, the sound of the back storage door being opened. My heart jumped into my throat. There was nothing back there except supplies and a rear exit. If he was back there, it meant one of two things. Either he was trying to get out without paying, or he was looking for a way back in. I stepped out from behind the counter, my shoes squeaking on the tile. Every step felt like a risk, each movement heavier than the last. I approached the storage door, gripping the handle tightly, and pulled it open just a crack. The light inside was off, and the narrow room was filled with shelves and boxes. But I could see a shadow, just the faint outline of someone standing perfectly still in the darkness. He was waiting. I let the door swing shut, my pulse racing. I had to think fast. If he was planning to rob me, I was trapped, alone in the middle of the night with no one around to help. The thought of running crossed my mind, but the door to the outside locked automatically. I was stuck. I retreated back to the counter, trying to appear calm, but my hands were shaking. I glanced at the security monitor, hoping to catch a glimpse of him leaving, but the screen stayed blank. The cameras didn't cover the storage room. Then the doorbell chimed again. I looked toward the front entrance, half expecting him to walk out, but the store was empty. The parking lot beyond the glass was still, the street lights casting long, lonely shadows over the pavement. I grabbed the phone and started dialing, but halfway through, I stopped. The faintest sound reached my ears, a soft rustling from the far side of the store. I knew he hadn't left. He was still inside. I scanned the aisles, my heart thudding against my ribs. Every row looked the same, empty, silent, too still. The air felt heavy with anticipation, like I was being hunted. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him. He was crouching at the end of an aisle, half hidden behind a shelf, watching me. His eyes locked onto mine, and I knew I wasn't getting out of this easily. I backed toward the counter, trying to keep him in my line of sight. He moved slowly, rising to his full height, his head still pulled low over his face. The only thing I could see clearly was the glint of something sharp in his hand, a box cutter, small but deadly. I fumbled behind the counter, searching blindly for the panic button beneath the register. My fingers found the switch just as he started toward me. The silent alarm triggered, but the store remained deathly quiet. He kept walking unhurried, as if he knew the police wouldn't get there in time. I braced myself, clutching the phone in one hand, heart pounding so hard it drowned out everything else. He was only a few feet away now, his footsteps soft and deliberate on the tile floor. Then, just as he reached the counter, the doorbell chimed again, a harsh, mechanical sound that broke the silence like a scream. He froze, his head snapping toward the door. The lights from a patrol car flashed through the glass, and he turned without a word, slipping through the back storage room before I could react. The officers arrived seconds later, but by the time they searched the store and the alley behind it, he was gone, vanished into the night, leaving nothing behind but a faint trail of muddy footprints. I quit the job the next day, too shaken to stay. Every time I hear the chime of a doorbell now, my chest tightens, and I brace myself for the worst. Because I know, somewhere out there, he's still waiting, watching for another empty store, another lonely shift, another chance to finish what he started. And